Hi, everyone. I think we're now live. Thanks for joining me for this, what I'm calling a special edition of Talking Deals with David. I think I got actually some messages this morning asking, or actually telling me how excited I was to be doing this. I think people could tell maybe from the posting. I don't think anybody expected to get so many sort of deep dives into divestitures, but I am really excited that Emilie Feldman can join us today. Emilie, it's great to see you.
Hi, David. Great to see you too. Thanks for having me.
No, this is terrific. And I actually, think, I don't know that I mentioned this to you, but I think this is kind of one of the other benefits of doing this LinkedIn experiment that I've been on, in the M&A world, because I think it was LinkedIn that I first saw your book. I don't know if that was a post that you had made, but I saw the book and I thought, wow, this is awesome. I've never, seen like a whole book devoted to um, divestitures. And I think we somehow connected and, sort of shared a love for all things M&A and divestitures. And so it was super exciting that you could join me. And I know that we had, I was telling you before we got on, I think just a huge turnout. I don't think that has anything to do with me, but I do think it has to do with the book and you. So I appreciate that.
Well, no, thanks so much. It's really nice to have the opportunity to be here and to connect with this audience. And yeah, super glad to have the chance here.
Thanks, Emily. And for everybody who hasn't been following Emily's sort of progress with the book, like I have, she's been just swamped with interviews and CNBC, and I was listening to a podcast that she just posted about. So if you're interested in learning more about this, of course, pick up her book, which I think they're going to have to do another printing. She mentioned, so get on the waiting list for that on Amazon or other places where you can get it. But also follow Emilie and see more of what she's doing, not only in the divestiture area, but other things. So, Emilie, I'll give you like a very quick, intro for people as they're still, logging on. But I posted a lot about it. But you have just sort of checked off, I guess, every box of what a person would want to have. 3 Harvard degrees, I think, is that right? Your doctorate, MBA, and undergrad all at Harvard.
Yep, exactly.
So that's awesome. And then has been teaching at Wharton, teaching sort of the capstone M&A class, which I would definitely love to sit in on, and other things. I think had run into you or your research around shareholders, governance, and I think you had written some things I had looked at on spinoffs and kind of interlocking directors. Was that an area of interest that you had as you were moving into focusing more on divestitures?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, my research is all about, and my teaching are all about corporate strategy, right? So, obviously, the big transactions that you just mentioned, M&A, divestitures, and all the subtypes of divestitures. But I'm also quite interested in corporate governance as well, and really see the intersection of those two fields as an incredibly fruitful area of research and practice, right? So, really understanding, for example, boards of directors and their decision making around these transactions, or activist investors and how they influence companies to pursue or not to pursue certain transactions. So yeah, I just find these areas really fascinating. And so you have a good memory. The dual directors interview was probably all the way back in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. But yes, I've been working on these topics for quite some time and remain really interested in them.
Well, what I really loved about your work, and especially the book, is sometimes, especially for practitioners, for those listening, Emilie is not a lawyer. Her dad was a bankruptcy lawyer, so she has that sort of in her blood, and I may ask her a little bit about that background. But Emilie, what I love about the book is that it has very kind of rigorous academic support and research that you're doing, which is really interesting. But it also has a very practical side to it, which appealed to me as someone who has done a lot of divestitures on the legal side. And I also thought, corporate executives, corporate development, people, they really can get into this and not only kind of have a better sense of what options there are around divestitures, but I think what's groundbreaking about it is you sort of smash the view that divestitures are kind of a last ditch sort of effort when you don't have anything else that you can do. And is that kind of a main focus that you were trying to get across with the book and some of the other writings that you're doing on divestitures?
Yeah, definitely. So let me react to two things actually that you just said, right? So first thing is, absolutely, like throughout my entire career, one of my big priorities has been to never become an academic who has her head in the clouds, right, or who lives in the ivory tower, right? So I've always, really prioritized and valued practice. Going all the way back to my decision even to apply to business PhD programs as opposed to economics PhD programs. That was actually a big driver of even that very early decision in my career. And so when I was writing the book, absolutely, the idea of making it appealing and useful and actionable for executives, lawyers, bankers, consultants, practitioners, executives was a huge priority for me. So for sure on that, and I'm glad that you picked up on it in the book itself. And then yeah, I mean in terms of the topic areas, right? I mean that was definitely part of it as well, right? So really thinking about all these different areas and how they might connect to this broader idea.
And did your dad, being a bankruptcy lawyer, which has a lot of overlays in terms of restructurings, being very creative around thinking through different structures in sort of a distressed scenario, did you think about going to law school, or did you have that? Is that where maybe some of the practical mix to the academic side comes from?
Yeah, I did. It's kind of funny. I was a bit of a naive undergrad at the end of college, right? Sort of applying frantically to a lot of things, but really kind of had a come to terms discussion with myself where it was like, okay, well, this is really the right path for me, right? Business academia is the right path for me. I mean, it's funny. You said that this stuff might be in my blood, and I think you have it exactly right. I was the 8-year-old kid sitting around the dinner table with my family, listening to my dad talk about the creditors committee, right? So literally, that's what I grew up with. So, I just think it's something that was imbued in me from a very early age. Both the topic and the practicality, and even though the path isn't always necessarily linear, right? You sort of end up kind of in the right place, I think, with those kinds of ideas. Yeah.
It's really fascinating. I always love sort of to get a feel of where people started and what their path was, and obviously you excelled in every way in terms of academic, but a lot of times that sort of beats out of you a bit the practical bent. And so you do get, I think, complaints from people, at least in my business on the legal side, that a lot of what's generated is not really useful, but this is super useful. So one of the things I try to do on my M&A posts that I do on LinkedIn is eliminate jargon, try to break things down to their essence. So I guess the first thing for people, there's a diverse audience. I noticed there were 65 or 70 people that had signed up, and it ranges from C-suite type executives to lawyers to bankers, business academics. So it's a broad range. But Emilie, why don't you kind of give everyone just a view of sort of what is a divestiture, and what are you looking at when you decided to put the book together?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, broadly speaking, a divestiture is a type of corporate transaction in which a company is removing, some line of business, a subsidiary, a division, certain assets that it no longer wants to have in its portfolio, right? So that's kind of the biggest definition of what these transactions are, and what I'm thinking about with this book. I think in terms of what I actually go through in the book itself, right? So the title is Divestitures: Creating Value Through Strategy, Structure, and Implementation, right? So those three words, strategy, structure, and implementation, are really kind of the guideposts for what the book goes through. So strategy is really referring to, why might companies want or need in certain situations to divest certain businesses or certain assets. And so I can talk more about the different reasons why this might happen, but that's really the focus of the strategy discussion. Structure refers to the different types of transactions within this broad umbrella of divestitures that companies can pursue. So the most obvious and common one is a sale, right? So I'm selling part of my business to another company or to private equity. But then there's a whole range of other types of transactions or structures that companies can use. Like spin-offs or reverse Morris trusts, or so on and so forth, right? So really that second section digs into the different structures that companies can use to actually effectuate the removal of certain businesses from their portfolios. And then finally, implementation is, more of the nuts and bolts, like how to actually do this. In terms of the day-to-day, what needs to happen to effectively execute one of these transactions. Not so much in terms of the structure of the transaction itself, but more in terms of what has to happen from a management, a people, a resource, assets, liabilities kind of perspective, right? So that's really the focus of the implementation side of the book.
Yeah, it's amazing, and there is, even though again Emilie, as I said, is not a lawyer, but there is a lot of really good, detailed material, particularly in the structure and in the implementation sections, where you'd expect, lawyers to have a much bigger, impact than on the strategy side. But one of the things I want to mention, since there are fair number of lawyers that are either listening now or probably will join, listen later. Lawyers often talk about sort of being business focused, and I know at my firm K&L Gates we really believe that, and I think it's a distinguishing feature of my firm, and at least the way I try to practice corporate law is, in order to really you know implement and try to achieve the strategic objectives that your client has, you have to have a really good understanding of these sort of business drivers, because much of the agreements and the approaches that you take, if you don't have that, it's very challenging. So I think for lawyers listening, thinking, boy, this is too, business focused. I don't think it is, and I think it's manageable. I think it's something that you can learn. And when you think about what drives divestitures, it's really a flip side to M&A. So these are concepts that you can really think about. But Emilie, one of the things that I know when I first saw the book, I thought, people just hate divestitures. It has such a negative connotation, and whenever you think about it, you'll hear people think that, well, this is the business must be doing poorly. This is something the company doesn't want, or it was a big mistake. Maybe the prior CEO bought something that never should have been moved into the portfolio of assets that the company has. Is that your sense too? And I get the feeling that you're trying to break that down and say, well, that might be for some, but there's a wider lens that you can look at divestitures than just getting rid of something that isn't doing very well.
Yeah, so let me answer. Let me actually piggyback on what you were just saying a minute ago, because I just want to reinforce one thing that you said that I couldn't agree more with, and then I'll talk about sort of this perception versus reality of divestitures question that you just raised, David. So the thing that I just wholeheartedly agree with, right, and was a big priority for me, was to say, so structure and strategy and implementation actually are inextricably linked to one another. It's super important to see that, right? So, if you're pursuing a strategy of trying to increase focus, right, oftentimes certain transactional forms and certain implementation approaches might be more applicable in those situations. Or if you are divesting something that's underperforming, or the company is underperforming, generating cash might be a big priority for you. And so that might imply certain decisions that you might make in terms of how you structure and implement those transactions as well. So yes, there's a legal component here that's incredibly important. But for me, actually, this was one of the biggest takeaways that I had when writing the book, was just how closely these three pillars, right, these three words actually are in terms of really understanding this phenomenon, right? So I just wanted to say that in response to what you were just mentioning a minute ago, David. So on the debunking side, right, and on the perception versus reality point. So yeah, I mean, this has been just a big bee in my bonnet, I guess, for many years now, as I've been working and doing research on this topic. Is that, yeah, I mean, people have this perception, academics do too, right? So it's not just practitioners, but there's a perception that divestitures are just, sort of a solution to a problem, or something's gone wrong, or we did a bad acquisition, or the strategy didn't work out, or whatever it might be. And so, we divest from a position of weakness or necessity, maybe. And so, that's true in certain cases, right? I don't want to minimize that. And I don't want to say it never happens, because obviously that's not correct. But what I've learned from my research and what I've seen from the studies that I've done and the conversations that I've had and the practitioner work that I've been involved in is that there's a whole other side to these transactions, in terms of seeing them as a really proactive tool for value creation. And yes, David, you're right that this is actually, a key message in my book, right? That we can actually see, huge potential and opportunity here from companies using these transactions. So without getting too far into, data and analytics and all this stuff, right? What we end up seeing, is that shareholder value creation on average is positive and significantly positive, for divestitures, both when companies announce them, but then also after the completion of these transactions. By comparison, if you look at M&A and their value creation, it's actually zero or even slightly negative, right? Both in the short and the long term. So, I think that, this discrepancy or this dichotomy even between M&A and divestitures in terms of their performance implication really underscores this point that divestitures are not just the admission of failure or defeat or something going wrong, that there actually are these proactive opportunities for using these transactions.
I mean, to me, it's really, interesting to see that. Whenever I see it, and you can maybe clarify it, I've seen numbers that say that, companies, one, rarely divest things that they buy, but it's almost like, I think currently it was almost like a 9 acquisitions to 2 divestments or something like that. But it's always much more significantly focused on M&A, which seems splashier maybe, or more interesting. Do you find that, like, it just the students that you're teaching, is there more focus on sort of getting bigger and having more revenue, more diversification? Why
Oh,
why
totally.
is that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's human nature, frankly, I think is what it boils down to, right? So, we all want to grow. We all want to be the king of a bigger kingdom, or queen of a bigger kingdom, I guess, queendom. I don't know. So yeah, I think that that priority on expansion is quite valuable. You see it in the headlines of the newspapers, right? Big happy sounding words like synergies and opportunities and value and gains when companies talk about mergers and acquisitions, and quite the opposite when you read articles about divestitures. So yeah, I think that there's many factors that kind of go into this, right? But yeah, it's a big difference, right, in terms of how these transactions are portrayed and perceived, especially relative to mergers and acquisitions.
Well, you wrote, I guess, as they say in life, and I think I've even written about it in M&A, timing is everything. And some people, have good timing. I don't know what your timing is generally, in your life, but in this, it seems like it's spot on, because, we came off of this incredible 2020, 2021,
Yeah.
M&A frenzy, bigger and more intense, at least in my 20 years or so. I can't remember it being quite that intense. And so a lot of companies, gobbled up a bunch of things and, expanded their revenues, diversified it, went into new geographic markets and, adjacencies, and did all kinds of things. Then as quickly as that happened, it slammed back down, um, through the second half of last year, and I think everything I'm seeing, personally, and just reading, you're still seeing that now. So people are now starting to think divestiture again. It's always linked to bad, something, headwind, something going down. Try to find ways to raise cash through selling something that's non-performing. So the book is like super timely, because people are thinking about divestitures. You hear activists now talking more about, pushing it out. You've seen, obviously, big companies in the news that are doing significant divestitures. So this is going to be, as I've been writing about, and I think you agreed with, sort of 2023 is going to be the year of the divestiture. But in a way, the timing was bad, Emily, because it detracts a little bit from the other message, which is that people should be thinking about these not just in headwind times, but when the market is in 2020 and 2021, right? Not just in the bad times or when there's headwinds.
Yeah, I was actually going to say exactly the same thing, right? It's sort of beautiful timing and terrible timing, right? So beautiful timing in the sense that, yeah, it's great to have a book on divestitures when everyone's going to be thinking about divestitures, but at the same time, right, it's sort of a little bit off message, I guess, in the sense of saying, well, yeah, I mean, yes, reactive kinds of divestitures in response to headwinds or things going wrong happen. Of course they do. But one of the big messages of the book is divest more proactively. So fortunately for me, life is long, right? And we have time, right? So the market will swing back. It always does, right? We can see incredible cyclicality in macroeconomic factors, and then of course in deal making activity as a result of that. And so the message will still be there, right? Even when the market picks back up, and even when things kind of bounce back. So it'll be important to kind of keep that message front and center, I guess, as that starts to happen.
Yeah, and well, and hopefully your book, and I'm sure you'll continue to kind of push that. I think it's an incredible lesson. But let me try to drill down a little bit more on that. So let's take out the non-performing asset case. Let's just assume that that there's a company that doesn't have any particularly non-performing assets, and benchmarked against their others. But so how do they think about, and should they do this on a almost like you do programmatic M&A, which at least in my mind always is more effective if you're not necessarily doing these huge mega deals, but you stick to a strategy and a thesis, and you do smaller acquisitions that continue to kind of build on that. Are you saying that companies, executives thinking about that should maybe do something like that, so that annually or some other period you're actually kind of reassessing your portfolio mix and thinking about ways to maybe reallocate resources? Or is it a different approach?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I would advocate, and this is actually an area where perhaps even the proactive divestitures might be helpful in responding to sort of the more negative macroeconomic environment that companies are going to be in for the foreseeable future. So yeah, I mean, I think I love the analogy to programmatic M&A, and I'll just share a little bit of something that I've found that I find quite fascinating here. So if you look at the relationship between corporate performance and corporate deal experience, you see kind of an upward sloping line, right? So, of course, companies do better in terms of their performance, their M&A performance, the more of those transactions that they undertake. So, that makes a lot of sense, right? You practice something, you get better at it, right? You build the M&A muscle, right? So that's the argument for programmatic M&A. If you look at the relationship between divestiture experience and divestiture performance, you basically get a scatter plot. You basically just get white noise. There's actually no discernible relationship between the number of divestitures that companies pursue and the performance of those deals. So why might that be the case, right? It's the case because companies rarely do enough divestitures to actually build the divestiture muscle that they would need to actually have that programmatic approach. And so, to your point, David, right? It's actually not even just about doing divestitures, but it's even about thinking about that portfolio review. Do we have divestible assets that don't fit within our portfolio? What could we be doing with the resources that are currently allocated to these businesses that maybe are not adding all that much to what our strategy is, what we're trying to pursue? What could we be doing with the money, with the time, with the management attention, with the physical capacity, with the people's capacity that is not currently being done? So I think that idea of starting to develop a more proactive you know relationship to these transaction and processes for thinking about and then executing these transactions would be a huge source of value creation for companies if they could start to do that. The other thing I'll say is that oftentimes what I'll hear is that when I talk to companies is that they have sort of a dedicated M&A team, right? So they call it the M&A team or head of M&A, right? And so what's unfortunate about that is that it neglects the entire rest of the pantheon of possible corporate corporate transactions. So, you could think about alliances, joint ventures, corporate venture capital, many different types of expansionary transactions that companies might pursue. But you could also think about divestitures. And I actually really think that having a more holistic practice and approach to thinking about corporate transactions would be a real way to start to develop, sort of more of a muscle around these transactions. When do you want to acquire? What kinds of businesses do you want to acquire? When do you want to ally? When do you want to partner? And then equally, when do you want to divest? And how do you think about these choices in a more integrated fashion? I think would be a really fruitful way for many companies to start rethinking their approach to these transactions, and equally for advisors like lawyers and consultants and bankers to start advising their clients as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So how does let's take a case of something that's spinning off a lot of cash, and let's say it doesn't, otherwise it's not non-performing, at least as benchmarked to other revenue streams within a company, but that it doesn't fit with where the long-term strategic vision of the company is going. To me, you're facing a lot of headwinds there, because you now have a business that's generating a lot of cash, it's contributing a lot to the earnings of the company. It's a pretty bold move to then say, especially if it's maybe the origins of the company. So you might have like a historic line of business. That's very difficult to then say, we're going to, move that out. And there's timing issues and complexities around separating the business, which you talk about a little bit sort of in the implementation side of the book. But what happens then? How does that increase value? So let's say that you do divest something like that. You now have a pile of cash. I assume in an environment like this with rising interest rates, maybe that gives you a little bit of a benefit. You now have cash, but how do you see that as? What do you do with that then? How does the company actually deliver these results that you're seeing, where it's accretive, it delivers more shareholder value by doing this? How does that happen? How do you accomplish that additional shareholder value?
Yeah, it's a great question. And let me kind of do two things actually in answering it, right? So I want to pick up on one thought that you had at the beginning of your question just now, in terms of how hard it might be to overcome some of these stories. And then again, I'll answer the question that you actually asked me to answer here. So I have many things to say in a professorial manner, I suppose, but
That's excellent.
forgive me for that.
No, it's great.
So yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? What you were talking about in terms of it being hard to actually do these transactions, right? So this is kind of the point, right, of what's going on with these transactions and why they're so underutilized, is that you hear loud and clear, all these negative stories. It's the legacy business. It's what the company was founded on. It throws off a lot of cash. We don't want to deal with the tax burden of divesting it, right? So you hear, sort of these big stories of why it's not a good idea to divest, but you hear much less about what could be done instead, or what the positive side of this is, right? So I talk about this in chapter 2 of the book, right? I advance a rubric which I call the better off test, which actually explicitly asks, executives and advisors and whatnot to weigh out, sort of what you're getting versus what you're giving up by actually continuing to own a particular business, right? So it's not to minimize, right? Yeah, certain businesses throw off cash flows. Yes, there's value in historical legacy and emotional connection, but what's the opportunity cost that you're paying, right, for indulging in those benefits, right? And so I think that clear-eyed view of get and give is really important to recognize. And unfortunately, the give is emphasized a lot of times in these divestiture discussions. What would we be giving up if we divested? But the get is often underemphasized, right? So I just wanted to kind of say that, David, because I think that really is a big issue in terms of how that actually plays out. So, then to kind of answer the question that you were asking, so we need to think about, like, how do we actually gain benefits here from these transactions, right? So one of the things, for example, that I talk about in chapter 3 of the book is, okay, so let's look at what happens in terms of performance from companies that only do acquisitions, only do divestitures, and then combine M&A and divestitures. So as we've been talking about, the companies that divest outperform outperform the companies that acquire, that's fine. But then if we look at companies that do both of the transactions in sequence or in combination with one another, we actually see that that third category even outperforms both of the individual categories, right? So to answer the question of, well, what do you do next, right? Well, you could pursue acquisitions, right? You could reinvest the capital into existing areas of the business that might benefit. And by the way, this is not just financial capital, right? This is other resources as well: physical capacity in plants, human resources, management attention, right? All of these kinds of elements are resources that can be reallocated. So I think that this idea of, and this is why, by the way, it's so important to have these more integrated corporate development functions that not only consider M&A, but that actually consider other types of transactions as well, because they should be intertwined with one another. So I think that idea of reallocation and really thinking through carefully, what's our strategy? What do we want to do, right? What are we trying to do? And where can we best utilize those resources is kind of the key point. The concept of opportunity cost, I think, is just a central, if I had to give two words to kind of characterize what the book is talking about, I would say inertia and opportunity cost, right, is really the key messages that go around with these kinds of transactions with divestitures. So that's what I would say in answer to your question, David.
Yeah, well, it actually, what you said, I think clicked a little bit. Maybe when I went through the book, I didn't quite get that. It actually, though, if you take the reactionary approach, which is kind of what we're seeing now, the markets are, you've got, rising interest rates, inflation, geopolitical stuff, all this going on, and you've got, activists or others, looking at depressed share prices and saying, hey, we need you to start doing some separation. So that's in a way, that's an easy one, because it's been forced upon you. So you now have, okay, somebody's identifying, this particular thing. Maybe we want to focus more on ESG capabilities or something else. So we need to get rid of this, or whatever it is that's being pointed at as something that's non-performing. Well, now you've identified it. And so in a way, it makes it easier. Your approach or a suggestion of kind of integrating the M&A function with the divestiture function, I could see that actually then puts it on management to actually know what they're doing, in the sense that you can't on a clear day, when you don't have pressures to divest things, but under your research, it still would be useful to do that from time to time. You have to know what you have to know what your strategy is and where you want your revenue mix to be, and you have to actually understand that, and also then make a commitment to that. Otherwise, you don't know what to move or how to move, and then it seems to me to stall. So you're actually putting more work on people, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And just two thoughts on that point, right? So my wonderful husband actually read well, many drafts of the book, but in one of the early drafts of the book that he read, he started talking to me about it at lunch or at breakfast one day, and sort of said, divestitures are strategy, right? And I think what he meant by that is that, I know what he meant by that was that they force companies to actually say, this is what we want to do, this is our strategy, this is what we're trying to accomplish, right? And so it's quite easy as a company to not be able to, or to not articulate that point very clearly, right? Because you're kind of going along, there's lots of pressures, there's lots of work, there's things going on, there's all kinds of activities happening. And so sitting down and really kind of getting down to the basics, like, this is what we want to do, this is our strategy, can be oftentimes a harder question than maybe is given credit for. And so, yeah, I mean, divestitures really focus the mind on what the strategy is, right? This is what we're trying to do. So I think that that's exactly right. And even that conversation with my husband, I think was a big insight for me as I was working on earlier drafts of the book. I thought that was a really powerful way of putting it. The other thing I wanted to say, David, is you mentioned kind of activist investors, and we've talked about it a little bit in passing here throughout our conversation so far. So I really I think that activist investors are quite fascinating. And, what's fascinating about them is, yes, of course, they press for divestitures and get companies to pursue these transactions, and it's reactionary. And I get all of that. But there's actually a slightly different way of thinking about these activist investors that I think can be quite powerful. So the way that I sort of see them is that they are prompting companies to do the things that they should be doing but are not doing, right? So yes, it's reactionary to, some kind of external pressure, but what prevents companies and executives from kind of taking that activist playbook and doing it themselves, right? So I think that idea of being proactive is exactly what the activists are bringing to the table. So I've been working with KPMG Deal Advisory for the past a long time now, 7 years probably at this point, on a series of research papers, white papers that you can find online if you're interested in reading more. And one of them is actually entitled Think Like an Activist, where we embrace this exact point, like, look, this is what activists are demanding that companies do. Can we as executives, or can you as executives, borrow from that playbook and do it yourself before the activist even gets to your door? And so, divestitures would be a key approach or tactic that companies could do, right, that not only would mitigate the activist attack, and that's great, but that also might allow companies to just capture some allocation by themselves without the activist even needing to get there in the first place. So I encourage you to take a look if you're interested in a little bit more from me on this topic. There's a whole series of white papers that are posted on the KPMG website, so you can read a little bit more about that if you're interested.
Oh yeah, I know, I definitely will. That's interesting. Well, and I guess it's always a good strategy in sort of the lowercase s approach to kind of game out, whether it's an activist or even in a deal, thinking through kind of how other people may view things, stepping a bit outside your own maybe somewhat insular kind of perspective. So that's that is very interesting. One of the things that you do talk about in the implementation phase, but I think it's interesting, is that companies that are great at M&A, let's just take corporates as opposed to more financial buyers. If they are going to capture, the value that they build into their pricing when they're doing a deal, they have to, achieve these synergies that you mentioned. Now, a lot of times, as you said, you know, they're overhyped. They aren't actually achieved, or they, overpay, in terms of valuation or other reasons. But the more you integrate the business, the more you kind of make it part of the whole, um, that creates another pretty strong barrier when people are sitting around thinking about doing divestitures. Because if you've done that right, then it's a real struggle a lot of times to unwind all of this stuff, and at a great cost, unwind all the stuff that you were so good at putting together and making as a whole. So separating a business that's been well integrated into everything else is a challenge. And I think certainly I've heard, and I believe from the legal side of things, these are some of the more complicated deals that you're going to do. M&A is a little more straightforward. And I think people might shy away a bit because they think, boy, that's going to be tough. How am I going to separate my finance function and my tax and my all the different my people, everything that I need to do? Um, how do you suggest people think about that? And or is that an issue that you do find in terms of maybe keeping people from focusing on divestitures more?
Yeah, so yes to both, right? Integration and interdependence is the enemy of divestiture, right? Because and this applies whether or not the asset that you're thinking about divesting was acquired or not, right? It could even just be something that was owned within the company. So, what happens is exactly like you're describing, David, is that you buy something, right? You acquire something, and you do post-merger integration, and you do a good job, right? And it eventually gets folded in, and so it's harder to separate. But even, we were talking about history before, corporate history. You've had thing for 50 years, 100 years, right? That's been part of your company. And so it just drives a lot of processes or activities, right? Factories have been producing these products since the very beginning, even if the company's portfolio has shifted in a completely different direction. Or, we were born as a company that was focused on, a certain set of capabilities, right? And that imbues everything else that we do, right? So it's not so tangible, but there's that integration in terms of how the company functions on a day-to-day basis. So, yeah, it's quite challenging from the perspective of both getting to the decision to divest, right? So the story would go, or the story would be, oh, we can't divest this, right? It would just be too hard to pull apart, everything that's integrated here within the organization. So that's the impediment even to the decision in the first place. But then, let's say you overcome that, right? And actually get to the point where you are actually doing the transaction, or you've decided to do the transaction, then you actually have to go ahead and unwind everything, right? So, the physical assets need to get separated, the people need to be allocated to the different parts of the business that have been separated. Management needs to be divided, et cetera, et cetera. And that is, hard in and of itself as well. So not only is there a decision-making impediment, but there's also an implementation impediment when it comes to this idea of integration and kind of managing that. So yeah, I think it's really hard. And to use some more practitioner terminology, right? This is what leads to problems like stranded costs, right? So when you're in a situation where that disintegration is difficult, right, and it's hard to kind of pull things apart, maybe the easy way out is to kind of leave certain assets in place, right, or to leave certain physical capacity in place. So all of a sudden you have an operation that's scaled for a much bigger size company, even though you've divested a big part of the business that's no longer there. So all of a sudden you have a big cost burden that you didn't need to have necessarily, but has kind of been imposed on the organization by virtue of that difficulty of disintegrating. So there are real, very tangible costs that happen as a result of this difficulty of disintegration that I think are important to note. So yeah, I mean, I think this is a really critical piece that actually flows through, two of the sides here of divestitures, both strategy and implementation.
Well, when you talk about stranded costs, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. So if so, is it true, or did your research kind of look at that a little bit? If you do a divestiture, but then you, just like with an acquisition, you have to make sure the integration is done right. If you do a divestiture, um, you could end up with these stranded costs. You have to kind of then, how do people look at that? Benchmarking that as a percentage of revenue or other things, and then you have to essentially do like a reverse. You have to do the cleanup after, not only with what was moved out, but what's left behind in order to get
Yeah,
that value that you're talking about out of the divestiture.
very much. Yeah. So, two thoughts on this, right? So one, just to share a little bit of the data in the book itself, right? So I think I talk about this in chapter 9 or 10. I can't remember at this point. You can take a look and tell me. But on average, right, in a sample of divestitures that I had been looking at, right, the size of the divested business relative to the divesting company was something like 20%, right? So in other words, the company was divesting 20% of its revenues, I believe. But if you look at the change in the cost structure, right, of the company, it was nowhere near that, right? I think it was a reduction in cost, or maybe it was 25% of revenues were being divested, but the reduction in cost was only like 20%. So there's a difference between, the size of the divested business and what's coming out of the divesting company versus the reduction in cost that goes along with that. And then even worse, right, I don't remember the proportion, but in some very large proportion of companies, the cost structure actually increased after the divestitures, right? So, it's pretty striking to see actually how bad, unfortunately, companies are at doing this, right? So, that's just kind of a little bit of color, I guess, or data around these issues that companies are not particularly good at reducing stranded costs. But then, to pick up on the other thing that you were saying just now, David, that I think is important, so yeah, a lot of times companies will not do a very good job at reducing stranded costs, right? And so they end up in a situation where they face them, they bear them, even after the transaction was complete. But the problem is that what happens is that companies kind of, keep going, right? The wheel keeps turning, right? And operations continue, and the day to day is busy, like I said before. And so, that mentality of, okay, we'll do the divestiture and we'll deal with the stranded cost problem later, unfortunately never happens, right? Or rarely happens. I don't want to say never. But it's quite difficult to kind of go back retroactively and sort of say, well, okay, yes, I recognize that I have this stranded cost problem. Let me fix it, right? It's much easier to just kind of continue with, status quo ante, and you have a higher cost structure than is necessary, but it never gets resolved, right? Because of everything else that's going on in the organization. So, I think that that's the problem, right? If it's not done proactively, right, if these kinds of things are not done proactively, it can really limit companies from achieving that value creation from these transactions, right? Or at least reduce the value creation from these transactions. And so that's what's a little bit problematic about this whole situation.
Well, the other thing is, and you cover this a little bit. I think what I sense is that if you are thinking about doing this, I say on a programmatic basis, but let's just say on a more recurring basis, you start thinking about your portfolio mix and whether that's in response to an activist or whether you're doing it, which I think is better in a more proactive way. These are transactions, and this is where I think for people that are lawyers who do this kind of work, you really need to jump on that early and almost be thinking about that well before you're going down that path, because speed matters. And I think I've seen, and I think you talked about, but if you don't if you drag out too long, again, you're dissipating value. So the longer this process takes, and it can be complicated. There might be, you talk about some of those regulatory issues, just issues with separating these businesses and the people issues. All of those, can be challenging, but you have to do it in an expeditious way. Otherwise, bad things usually happen. Rarely do good things happen from that. But is that your kind of sense that you've got to think about this and package the business right for the seller or for the buyer that you think is most likely going to take that, and then get on that process quicker, rather than delaying it?
Yeah. So again, kind of two reactions here, right? So, just to put some data around this, for one thing, right, if we think about the time lag that it takes even to get companies to make the decision to divest, right? Not even talking about implementation or any of the stuff that we've been focusing on just now in our conversation, just to make the decision, right? On average, it's a 7-year wait or 7-year lag between the time that an acquisition fails and a company divests, right? So that's one specific type of divestiture, the acquisition failure category that we were talking about before. But 7 years, imagine, right, before you even make the decision to divest the business, right? Even in a more or a less dramatic kind of situation, right? Let's just say that something is going wrong within the industry that the divested business operates in. My research shows that it's a minimum of 18 months minimum before the decision to divest is even contemplated, right? And then from there, you actually have to go and execute the transaction, right? So to answer your question on that point, David, yeah, there's a huge lag in terms of how long it takes companies just to come to the decision to do a divestiture in the first place. And then from there, right, speaking more to, kind of the question that you asked, right? So then you actually have to implement it, right? You actually have to do it, right? So when do you start thinking about that? Do you start thinking about that at the end of the 18 months or the end of the 7 years? Or, maybe you would be better starting to think about that at the time that the decision actually starts to happen, right? So, words, can you be proactive about implementation, at the time of decision making, as opposed to making the decision to divest, going through the whole process and then starting implementation. And by the way, I'll note actually that this is something that even if we put divestitures completely to the side and talked, for example, about mergers and acquisitions, this is a best practice that I think that companies could really do well to adopt, right? So understanding that there are legal restrictions as to the exact time that you can really operationally start post-merger integration, can companies at least start planning for post-merger integration during the due diligence phase, even during the deal negotiation phase? How are we thinking about strategic value here? How are we thinking about synergy opportunities? What are the risks that we foresee, and how do we intend to deal with them? All of these are questions that can at least be thought about right earlier in the process than they currently are. So I think that the idea of proactivity and the idea of starting to at least plan for these kinds of issues that are inevitably going to come up, whether it's an M&A or a divestiture or another type of corporate transaction, is a key best practice actually that I've seen in my research and my work with practitioners that companies would do well to adopt.
It's great. And actually, I'm not going to hijack it with a plug, but actually we're thinking about the same thing, because I'm doing another one of these on integration best practices. But one of the and it's coming up on I think the 24th. But one of the things we're going to talk about with one of my partners, Lauren Donahue from our Chicago office, who's an antitrust partner, is just that. How can we create an approach where you kind of move forward the integration process earlier, rather than sort of waiting for the famous kind of day one, and then as if a lights switches, you start going. And I think there's been too much focus on the legal restrictions, what you can't do, as opposed to thinking about what you can do. And there's a lot of room there, without getting yourself afoul of antitrust law. So that's, for people who are listening, maybe that might be useful to tune into. So at the risk of oversimplifying, and for people listening, if you want to lob in questions, please do so, because we're going to wrap up in a bit. I do see, Adriana, you've offered a rousing support. I don't know if you can see that, Emilie, but one of your former students was talking
Adriana.
about,
Hi, Adriana. Yeah.
talking about how awesome your class was, and all of that. So that's great. So anybody does have questions while Emilie is here, feel free to type those in. But at the risk of oversimplifying and then getting a bad grade, which I don't want to do, because that wouldn't be good. What I'm thinking, what I think you're saying in very kind of in a reductionist way, is that if you just do M&A and you don't on a regular basis think about divestitures, unless you're just spectacular at doing M&A and you're just making all the perfect picks and nothing exogenous is changing in the market or anything, which is not a likely scenario, that's not going to be an ideal strategy, regardless of what industry or where you're in. That the pure M&A, no adjustment kind of approach. If you're doing the opposite, which is you're just divesting everything, that doesn't make sense, because you're going to end up as a holding company with just cash. You'll have no businesses. So that strategy might have some near-term benefit, because you're doing what you're suggesting, which is capturing value by increasing focus and putting resources into areas that you want to do. But if you keep divesting, then you're going to eventually get smaller scale. You're going to lose some of the benefits of having that scale, and you'll just divest yourself out of business. So that doesn't seem to make sense. But what you're saying is the mixed strategy of combining, targeted, maybe I use that word programmatic. I don't know if that's the right word, but programmatic type M&A, where you're making, decisions on strategy and thesis, and you're following those in a series of thought out acquisitions. Hopefully you're developing expertise, you're integrating well, all of that stuff. But then you're also moving out assets on a much more regular basis than that 6-year or 7-year cycle that you were mentioning, would be more optimal. Is that, in terms of a basic approach?
Yeah, you got it. A+ for you, David. That's
Okay.
exactly right.
That's what
I
I
couldn't
want to
have said
hear. I
it
was
better.
worried.
Yep.
Okay. I was
No, you're
worried.
good. You're top of the class here.
Okay. Well, that's good. Yeah. So, and I think that if you're thinking about that, is your suggestion then to companies that you almost, instead of just calling it M&A, that you just create, in your M&A group, you just have divestitures as part of it? I mean, a divestiture in a way is M&A. Like I actually, before reading your book, I always thought of M&A and divestitures the same, in the sense that I wasn't thinking of it maybe in a technical way, because every divestiture is someone else's acquisition in most cases, unless you're closing it or something. But or doing a spin. But basically, somebody's on the buy side. So I never really separated it from the legal end. But it sounds like from your side on the business, there is it's not really included in the typical playbook on the M&A team.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And to be honest with you, this is one of the biggest reasons, one of the biggest reasons why I decided to write this book, right? Is that it pained me to kind of see divestitures just as a chapter in, a book about M&A, right? And yeah, you're right. I mean, in many cases, right, especially with sales, right, it is a flip side kind of thing. If I buy something from you, you're selling it to me. So absolutely, there is that duality there. But at the same time, there's so much more to these transactions that I think just gets under recognized when we just lump them together with M&A, right? So, my job with this book, right, or at least my perceived job with this book was to kind of say, well, can we really understand these transactions as a phenomenon into themselves, right? Understanding that they interact in extremely important ways, like you just said, with mergers and acquisitions, both from a strategic perspective and even from kind of a transactional perspective in terms of counterparties. Yeah, for sure, it does. They do. But at the same time, there's a whole lot of nuance here that we need to understand in terms of why companies might do them, how we can structure them for value creation, and then how we can implement them effectively. And even on that last point, right, the implementation of a divestiture is not just the reverse of post-merger integration, right? So I think that even bears saying in and of itself. So, yes, I do want to acknowledge that, there is that relationship and there has to be that relationship to M&A, but at the same time, there's also, some real independent value in divestitures as a transactional type, but then also as a strategy as well.
Well, yeah. Thanks for that, Emily. That's really helpful. Now before we end, I do want to I'm going to show everybody, my copy of the book so you can sort of see it. Although I have done pictures so you can see it. I just now have to find a way, Emily, that you can sign it so I have some, record that this actually happened. So we'll have to
With pleasure.
we'll have to figure that out. And then I was going to mention, but I decided I'd end up going too far astray. But if you read the book, you'll see in the very beginning, I think it's in the introduction or the early chapter, a really great analogy that Emily has about sort of pruning a tree and thinking about how not only does that work in nature in terms of some of the benefits of doing that, but it has a direct connection to M&A. And then I wrote a little bit about my own analogy to it with dinosaurs, which is why for people that are observant, I wanted to point out the dinosaurs in the back that they don't normally live there, but I put them there because I also wrote in one of the posts that Emily and I were kind of going back and forth on about a similar analogy that one could think about. But I think this is just such a fascinating topic, and I love the fact that we're going to see so many divestitures this year. I just hope that with your work and keeping this sort of out there, and I'll certainly keep doing my part to encourage people to follow not only the book, but the writings and the research that you're doing, is don't let that go away. When market conditions return in the end of 2023, hopefully, or 2024, keep this in your repertoire of things to be thinking about.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's amazing. And yeah, I think that's exactly the point here, right? And that'll be what you'll hear me say for the next several years at least, right? That yeah, companies really need to think differently about these transactions. So I hope that I succeed in my objective here from that perspective.
Well, you definitely do. I mean, it's like I said, I mean, obviously academically terrific, but also great, writer. How was that process of writing the book? Because you're used to writing, I assume more academic papers, even with that more practical, bent that you have. But tackling a book seems to me, a different, kind of a different animal. So was that a fun process? Something that you want to,
Yeah.
do again, or is that something I did one, I'm out, one and done?
Yeah, no, I had a great time with it. Actually, I have to say, it's like you said, it's a very different writing style than if you pick up any of my journal articles, you'll see a very different flavor of my writing and analysis and thinking. So that's definitely there. But I learned a ton from it. Actually, I have to say, right, in terms of really filling out my knowledge, especially on kind of the structure and implementation pieces of it. That was kind of a big learning experience for me. But then also, especially on the examples, right? I really, like I said before, wanted to make this come to life and, illustrate what I was talking about. I didn't want this to just be ivory tower, academic mumbo jumbo, right? I wanted this to be real. And so, researching all these companies and what they had done and why they had done it was incredibly valuable for me, in terms of learning about, how these transactions actually work, like what's the pulse of them actually within companies, what problems do they face, all of these kinds of things I think were super important for me. And then yeah, in terms of the writing, there's nothing more luxurious I think than being an academic, right? Because you basically get to sit and think and write about what you like. So in that sense, I feel super privileged to have had the opportunity to, take the year and a half that it took me to write this, and just kind of sit with my thoughts and, my chapters, and get this to where I wanted it to be. So it was a really wonderful experience. We'll see about the next one. It won't be imminent, but I have some ideas brewing that I'm sure I will put pen to paper at some point.
Well, it's really nice to see also, and I think that's maybe why you and I connected, because I've always loved doing M&A and doing corporate work and what I do. And sometimes it may not quite have that luxurious, feel to it as more the academic, but I do think it makes a huge difference, and it comes through, when you talk and we've interacted. So, I mean, that's just been great. Did you delay? The book is really up to date in many ways. It covers some ones that deals that are fairly recent. Were you kind of writing up almost to the end there, or how did that kind of final thing goes? But it reads very current, I guess I would say. It doesn't have that feeling that it's dated at all, in
Yeah.
any way.
Yeah, no, I really took pains to make sure that I got the most recent, content in there as possible. It was funny. I mean, so I submitted my final manuscript to the publisher on March 31st. That was my deadline. But then, of course, you have copy editing, and so I
Hmm.
suspect that I drove my my copy editors a little bit crazy, because I was always kind of tweaking footnotes and adding in new footnotes to kind of say, well, this is a good example, like the Kellogg's spinoff that happened this summer, right? Is made its way in there, or some of the more recent things about CFIUS kind of made their way in there at the very
Right.
last minute throughout that copy editing. So yeah, we'll see how long the recency kind of lasts. It was important to me to make sure that it was sort of really fresh and to date with the examples and stuff.
And Niv actually, who is going to be participating in that integration one that we did. She asked how long. I think you answered, Emily, though. Was that 18 months or so of
Yeah,
kind of
so
from start to finish of writing it?
yeah. So I started writing in like April of 2020, right when the pandemic started, actually, and then submitted the so just about 2 years, right? So I submitted the manuscript March 31st of 2022, so just 2 years, and then like 6 months of copy editing, and then it went to the printers, I think, on like September 30th of this past year. So it's long, right? It's definitely a long process when you're working on these things, but well worth it in the end.
Oh, it's great. And it's got to be nice to actually see, the finished product, and then also to just see the reception that it's got. Emily was telling me that it's doing great on Amazon. It's she's been on CNBC and all these things, and Wharton seems to be really helping and encouraging, and I see it all over the place. So you've had a busy schedule in terms of just talking about it. So that must be nice to realize that, hey, people are actually interested in divestitures. You must have thought for a second when you're writing it, like, is this the right topic? And do I call it divestitures? Because nobody's going to know what that means. And what does that mean for selling the book? But it seems like you've been able to get out there, and people are very interested and excited about it. Maybe not as excited about it as I was or am, but, but excited about it.
Yeah, no, it's really been great, and I'm super grateful to Wharton. I have to say they've just been amazingly, incredible and wonderful at helping me get the word out, and helping me get these opportunities to interview and do all of these things. But yeah, I mean, people, my friends would kind of make fun of me, like, oh, haha, this is going to be some great, bedtime reading to fall asleep with, kind of make me feel a little bit sad inside. But I think I'm proving them wrong, because it seems to be doing quite well. So it's gratifying from that perspective as well.
It's really a great thing, and I know you've been busy with so many things, so I really appreciate you willing to do this with somebody that, again, it's a little bit of a experiment for me. So you could have easily said, "I don't know who this person is. No, I'm not going to do it." But I really appreciate that you have been so great and supportive of some of the posts I did about the book, and I really appreciate you spending this much time, and I know everybody listening to it and who will listen to it later is going to get a tremendous amount of value from it. So please pick up the book, everybody, read it. If you have questions, reach out to me and or Emily, of course, and we're happy to talk further. But I really appreciate that, Emily. This is a great discussion. I think it was just awesome. I learned so much, and I appreciate your expertise and willingness to share it with everyone.
No, thank you so much for having me. I had a great time, and it's been great to connect and have the opportunity to interact, David. So thanks to you.
Thanks. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. I appreciate it. And I think the next one I'm doing is on the new FTC proposed ban on non-compete. So that one is coming up with two of my terrific K&L Gates employment labor partners. And I think that's coming up on Tuesday. So next Tuesday, I'm sure I'll be posting about it. So appreciate that. Emilie, just awesome. And thank you so much for doing it. And again, pick it up before it runs out. Okay. Thanks so much, Emilie. I appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
Okay. Bye, everyone.